In 2014, a film would come out that would completely recontextualize the revenge genre in almost every way, and that of course is John Wick. This movie was so influential that whenever an action film has a scene set in a nightclub or has intense electronic music, I think about Keanu going on a deliciously decisive rampage. Revenge stories like this feel entirely justified because of what he's fighting for, so whenever Mr. Wick decides to shove a pencil in some guy's ear, you don't feel too bad. Now, John Wick is obviously inspired by countless other things too. It's wrong to say that the modern revenge tale landscape is just adhering to its template, but it's equally stupid to not acknowledge how much of an impact it had. Now, the interesting thing is, since John Wick's release, there haven't actually been too many games that felt directly or even partially inspired by it in the AAA space. I think IO Interactive's latest Hitman trilogy takes a lot of visual cues and borrows its general tone though, which is pretty different to the bleached chemical tone of the original Hitman games. That clean, vibrant aesthetic, the confidence that Agent 47 has when walking through an area, it all matches up with the sleekness of John Wick's presentation. Then, one day, I screwed up a level in Hitman and decided to write it out and take out all the enemies that approached, and that led to a really fun shootout at the Paris Fashion Show, and heavily reminded me about certain scenes in John Wick. This then got me thinking about all of the other action movies I've seen where the hits the fan and suddenly the tempo of everything changes. And that had me wanting games that elicited that same feeling. Third-person shooters are probably where your mind goes first, but they don't have the bite I'm looking for, generally speaking. The ebb and flow of a level where combat is only triggered once you've been spotted, and you have that uh-oh moment and have to scramble for the nearest bit of cover. I then thought that the genre I'm looking for is obviously more stealth games. Getting caught in a stealth game turned from feeling like something to be annoyed at to being an opportunity to trigger some cool scenarios. It used to be a case of, I got caught? Oh well, let's reload a save and try again. And then turned into, I got caught? Well, RIP, let's make some memories. Payday 2 is probably the easiest way to explain what I mean, unless you get sad when someone alerts the guards and decides to restart the whole heist from scratch. That ain't me. I live for when the poop hits the tarmac. This game also literally has John Wick in it, so there's that. But the moment the cops start showing up, the music starts to get ready, all leading to the assault phase where it is absolute carnage as every player tries to deal with the onslaught. It leads to such frantic moments that feel way cooler because they're a direct response to your team failing to stay hidden or stop the call to the police from getting through. And you'd be surprised how this exact sort of playstyle affects other stealth games. This sort of screw stealth playstyle is not an easy one to commit to though, mainly because most stealth games are designed to make combat as painful and unfun as possible. The idea being that if combat was easy to engage in, then most players would just do that instead of partaking in the stealth. There's an argument to be made there, but I think that choice ultimately comes down to reward. Hitman games awarding out the Silent Assassin rating for a mission will always be incredibly satisfying, and that's reward enough to commit to not being a homicidal maniac. And Deus Ex, which lets you actively build a stealthy character, so using those abilities and keeping to that playstyle feels satisfying. But Deus Ex was also one of the first stealth games to make combat bearable, so that non-stealthy playstyles could work well too. This is a good choice because it makes nearly any kind of playstyle feel valid, and a player that decides to commit to one or the other will have as much fun as someone that wants to mix and match. Assassin's Creed has almost always been a bizarre franchise that likes to think it has good stealth mechanics, when in reality, it took them 8 games to make crouch walking and proper cover taking a thing. The social stealth in Assassin's Creed 2 was cool though, and felt like an appropriate mechanic for the kind of game it is. Blending into crowds, disappearing into a sea of bodies, made for some interesting moments. But getting into combat was never much of an issue thanks to the counter system being the easiest thing to use in a game next to the jump button, which ironically Assassin's Creed 2 has trouble with at times. Assassin's Creed knows its usual punishment for stealth isn't challenging though, so what it instead does is give plenty of main missions an instant game over if you're found. A punishment that I think is the most boring and frustrating one out of the lot. And that brings us over to my next point. Getting caught in a stealth game is usually a fail state in one of two ways. The game either says, you suck, go do it again, or you say, I suck, let's do it again. And instead of handling the consequences of the alert phase, you reload a checkpoint and do it all again. I'm not saying that, this is actually the wrong way to play stealth games, because of course you'd want to do well and not screw up. I'm not suddenly saying screw you to every ingrained stealth game concept. What I am saying is that I think stealth games that give you the tools necessary to deal with conflict like this are really cool. Suddenly, a quiet and introspective experience explodes into something frantic and dangerous. The environment takes on a whole different relationship where now you scramble to cover or look for a hiding place and wait for your enemies to converge on the perfect spot where you can just throw a grenade in there and just get them all done in one go. So let's take a look at some stealth games that break the rules a little bit and let you bring some real chaos to the streets in ways that are anything but sneaky. Hotline Miami is not a stealth game, but it does sort of encapsulate the vibe of what I'm trying to say. And it technically does have a stealthy state when enemies don't know you're there, so it counts. Now, if you want to talk about violent, vengeance-fueled video games, then I feel like Hotline Miami should be at the top of the list. This game is a roller coaster ride of death, punctuated by the dozens of retries you'll do before getting the perfect run, only to have to face the consequences of what you've done as the kick-ass music mutes itself on the way out the door. The adrenaline of a level quickly subsides as you're forced to take a look at what you've just done. The spectacle has been taken away and the reality comes crashing through the door. This is a game that is almost screaming that you, the player, are the monster of this world, and continuing to experience the game will only cement that fact. A level usually consists of scoping out the areas ahead of you while moving from room to room, taking out each enemy you find. Getting the surprise in enemies is key since all it takes to kill you is a stray bullet or a single swing from a bat, so using doors to knock enemies to the ground or strategically waiting for guys to line up for a string of lethal attacks is how you survive. You essentially play chicken until it's time to be a wolf, and no, I'm not referring to comparative types of play, I'm talking about the literal masks you unlock. Hotline Miami is equal parts cathartic as it is brutally horrifying, and I think it taps into something important for the genre in question in this video, violence being cathartic, especially when you're caught in the act and need to act quickly to defend yourself from an onslaught of incoming enemies. In the handful of hours it takes to play Hotline Miami, I always find myself flicking between these moments of excitement as I duck in and out of rooms to dodge enemies and swing my bat, only to have those feelings immediately contrasted with something that feels horrifying. I don't think it's said enough, but Hotline Miami really is a freaky game from these big talking heads that don't elicit much emotion besides... yeah, to those moments I mentioned before where you get to soak in your good work, only to then be judged for these actions periodically by a group of high authority furries, only the highest respect to you, my friends. Hotline Miami's big through line is that as you commit these acts of violence, you're periodically judged and sort of punished for them, be it through circumstance taking the life of someone you've saved or by nearly dying yourself. But ultimately, Hotline Miami puts you in the position of a character that doesn't outwardly express themselves in many ways outside of the initial reactions to killing someone or slowly losing his mind through all the carnage it causes, which makes understanding why all of this is happening pretty hard to do. And then Hotline Miami decides to rip away the one nice character you'll meet all game. Our friendly cashier who we see at the corner store, VHS store, pizza place and bar is eventually replaced by someone who is a lot less friendly, with our friend now laying dead beside him. The deaths eventually catch up with the main character and haunt his every waking step, but because Hotline Miami doesn't offer any deep characterization beyond what the player experiences, it's hard to understand a lot of the meanings at play here unless you really dig around, which is why Hotline Miami 2 exists. Not understanding what's going on is a cool vehicle to experience this kind of game though. Someone who is simply doing all of this because they're being told to without questioning why. Or maybe it's because they just really enjoy it. Just like the player may not be questioning why, and are instead focusing on how to get a higher score in each level. There are some pretty clear-cut meta reasonings behind the story, and if you get really deep, you can find an intricate web that ties all of the game's ideas together, which Hotline Miami 2 does a good job of expanding, at times screaming at the player what the first game's true intentions are. But there's something about the service level experience of the game that intrigues me more. I think the way that Hotline Miami 2 tries to spec spell out everything that these games are about is a little stiff. If we were to compare Hotline Miami to any other conventional stealth game, we'd obviously not get much in common. But if we compare the alert states, well, that's where the similarities lie. And it's not like Hotline Miami makes clearing a room of enemies a walk in the park. You die in one hit and can easily get overwhelmed if you aren't careful. Frankly, it takes a lot of luck to get through some of these encounters without dying to an enemy you never saw coming. Hotline Miami's ultimate takeaway for me is that violence is really quite a lot of fun, even if it makes me feel strange. It's fun to rush into a room and perfectly dispatch every enemy on screen while somehow avoiding death yourself, to catch the guy crawling away and finish him off before moving on to the next. And the game confronts this level of violence and the player's potential enjoyment of it by telling the protagonist that he will never understand the full picture and nothing after this point serves any purpose. But in that sense, this is hardly breaking a rule of stealth, right? The game is punishing the main character for killing people, but since it's a core part of the story that you cannot avoid, I think it fits into this video's criteria. Killing is mechanically rewarded by giving the player new weapons and masks to use, and getting a better high score feels really good to do. Perfecting your approach to each level feels incredible, but being able to improvise when things go wrong is even cooler, and this exact sort of experience can weirdly be applied to a game that you may not immediately think of. Splinter Cell Conviction is a bit of a guilty pleasure for me. It's a game that willfully and perhaps even gleefully steps away from the mold that made Splinter Cell, well, Splinter Cell. I always found this series to be oddly elegant with the way everything would usually play out. Sam is plopped into a mission and has to use the darkness to avoid enemies and get to his objectives unseen, all with the aid of the latest weapons and technology that help take down any enemies that so happen to be in his path. Now, in terms of breaking the rules, Splinter Cell Conviction seemingly has all of the basic bullet points you'd expect from a stealth game. However, it essentially takes everything that made Splinter Cell and throws it into a burning tire pit, and I kind of love it for how insane that move is. Splinter Cell nearly always encouraged you to stay hidden, but didn't totally discourage taking enemies down if you had the chance. Sam could knock them out quickly and silently, but he could also grab them from behind and politely ask them a few questions about the mission at hand. This could also give you some clues as to where the story may be headed at times. So Splinter Cell encouraged taking down enemies a fair bit and would often reward you for the trouble with information, but also you would need to hide those bodies carefully to avoid an earful from Lambert.
Better you than me. Oh my God! We're not going to be able to talk our way out of this. I think this means war. God help us all.
The first three Splinter Cells fit neatly into a stealth simulator sort of genre, where real-life rules and logic apply to almost all the decisions you have to make. And yes, split jumps are an extremely realistic combat maneuver, I am sure. But the rules usually remain the same. Stick to the shadows, stalk your enemies, and take them out when the moment presents itself. The pace is slow, the aesthetics are suitably dark, and mistakes usually lead to a swift game over or player-mandated reload. Splinter Cell Conviction has a lot of the same ideas, however, the way they are presented could not be more different. While the old games disincentivize active combat by giving you a gun that can randomly miss headshots, which is genius by the way, Conviction says, "This world is changing ever so slightly. The flow is moving. As you are killed, as you die, you will slowly understand." Gone are the non-lethal takedowns, varying scales of darkness, and a generally quieter and more introspective mood. Hello are the bombastics of 7th gen action and cover shooting spectacle, with a hint of the old Splinter Cell DNA hanging on by virtually a thread. Slipping into darkness is now a binary on-off state. There's no longer a delicate balance between moving quickly enough to avoid enemies while being sure to create no noise. This deconstruction of Splinter Cell is so interesting because it flies in the face of everything fans of the series had grown to love at this point. Just compare this game to Chaos Theory, the game everyone agrees is the best in the series, and try to find the similarities that aren't both games starring a guy that's been too old for this for 20 years now. And sure, we can pinpoint the start of this shift with Double Agent, but that game still mostly plays like a Splinter Cell game for the most part. Conviction is a stark difference in almost every way, which is a pretty ballsy move to have done for seemingly no reason. This direction for Splinter Cell is so intriguing considering they could have just made 10 more Chaos Theories, and the series would probably still be going strong today. I have to say though, I'm glad that Conviction is the way it is because it is so different. The first few levels put Sam in populated areas at first with civilians just living out their day, which is bizarre to see in a Splinter Cell game, for a start. Simply put, Conviction plays way more closely to a regular third-person shooter, with Uncharted probably being the most similar sort of framework. Sam can clamber over desks, climb up ledges, and shimmy along pipes with speed. These sorts of movements give Sam agency in the environment to hide from enemies or set up a fight from a location that's most advantageous. But it usually comes with the caveat of making Sam very vulnerable if he's discovered in a position like this. This spells out what Conviction's key premise in its gameplay is. Your first goal is usually to melee an enemy, since this unlocks the mark and execute ability. You can mark enemies regardless, which helps with keeping track of where they are, but the ability to do some John Wick shit is gated behind first smacking someone in the face. It's an interesting way to balance the ability, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a balanced move in general. Meleeing an enemy isn't necessarily hard to do, and executing 4 enemies at once usually ends combat pretty quick. But part of the fun of Conviction is the ease of tearing through bad guys like tissue paper. These sorts of moves don't come easy on the game's realistic difficulty either, which is where I think it's at its most fun. Mistakes are heavily punished on this mode, so it makes every move you make matter. 9 times out of 10, you're going to be ending confrontations with a fight. This isn't one of those games where you can sneak past enemies without laying a finger on them, and the times that the game does let you do this is rare, so the relationship it has with stealth is a fleeting one at best. The stealthy part lasts for the first portion of an encounter as you scout out the room, and if you can melee each enemy, you've got a good chance of leaving without much fuss. But if you shoot someone and another enemy sees it, you're gonna get into combat. Now, while Sam has plenty of movement options, controlling him is on the stranger side. I would say that Sam feels really sticky in this game due to all of the little micro animations that have to play out while you do things like getting into cover, poking out of cover to shoot, climbing stuff, meleeing enemies. Everything feels a little sticky, and that's what gets you killed most of the time on realistic mode. Sam is not invulnerable during any of these animations, so if you decide to run up to someone and his buddy sees you, you're going down pretty quickly. What this ends up doing is create a balance between setting up a combat encounter and then executing that plan with efficiency. If a group of enemies is clumped together, it'd be a good idea to use a remote bomb to get them all at once. If enemies are spread out, then it might be a good idea to use the sticky camera to draw a couple of them together. And then when combat does begin, swift marking and making use of the darkness around you can give you the upper hand when the situation calls for it. Even with all that prep, Sam doesn't function the best in active combat. He has a role, but it's pretty slow and doesn't cover a lot of distance. It's great in limited situations though, and it's satisfying to roll into cover this way. Sam is also extremely inaccurate while moving, to the point that bullets feel like they're magically avoiding enemies on purpose despite him for trying to be too badass and running into a combat encounter with an MP5. So the best way to tackle most situations is by being methodical and careful, but you also don't have to play like that. My favorite way to play Conviction is with the same sort of mentality as Hotline Miami. Cause as much chaos as I can and see if there's a way out of it. Conviction has a lot of stuff that makes this pretty difficult, like I just mentioned, but it's an oddly satisfying way to experience the game. It's hard to say that it's not entirely designed to be played like this, but I also feel like the intention was not for players to burst into rooms with a shotgun at every available opportunity. Playing this way feeds into Conviction's narrative in a nice way though. After years of Sam being kept on a pretty tight leash by Third Echelon, he's free to handle stuff however he wants now. And what better way is there to spit in the face of those restraints by acting like a complete maniac that crushes doors like tissue paper. Enemies are terrified all of the time when Sam acts like this, by the way, screaming at every little noise they hear, empowering every move you make as you know it's getting to them, getting revenge on whoever gets in your way, even if they don't technically deserve any of it. But after having multiple games where murder is punished, either with Lambert being mad,
Good Lord, Fisher, have you gone mad?
or the results screen making you sad, Conviction's indifference to killing is shocking. And for the most part, Conviction doesn't care to question this shift at all until the very end, where you can suddenly get to choose whether to kill or spare Reed. It's a frankly bizarre choice to suddenly have at the end of a game where such a choice has literally never been presented. And while Sam does spare people in the game, it's never a choice made by the player. Maybe it's positioned to be a way for Sam to come back from this journey, to finally put a pin in this vengeance-fueled ride. I don't know though, because I shot this guy instantly, so I guess Sam's learned nothing after all. I kind of despise Conviction's ending purely because it gives Sam this choice right at the very end of the game them for next to no reason. You can't just spare the person at the very end of the journey to make up for all of the blood you spilled to get there. And because Conviction never confronts this new and dangerous Sam Fisher that's just killed about 100 people, the violence that he wreaks ends up meaning nothing. And in doing so, it ends up breaking a massive stealth rule. Killing people does not matter, which, especially for a Splinter Cell game, is a complete 180 from what this series used to communicate to the player. This shift has a narrative purpose that unfortunately doesn't really go anywhere by the end, but seeing Sam Fisher do these sorts of things is a breath of fresh air. Now, to some, that air will smell absolutely rank and disgusting, but as I've said, this complete betrayal of Splinter Cell's usual antics is so disgusting, I can't help but love it. But if we're talking about stealth games and morality and, you know, having murder matter, there's only one game I think we need to talk about. I've spoken about Dishonored's chaos system in the past, and I can't remember what I said before. I like the system a lot as a whole for the ways it can vary a playthrough, but I don't think it's a good moral system because it takes a lot of the nuance out of certain decisions by assigning them to a good or low chaos binary. So I think that needed some tweaking, but the way that strict low or high chaos playthroughs pan out is really fun and intriguing. Now, yes, you can play this game like a regular stealth game and not kill anyone at all if you decide to do that, but you can just as easily become a mass murdering psychopath with a story that ends up reflecting that pathway if you so choose. So we'll be focusing on that aspect of things, but for clarity's sake, let's go through how low chaos works first. Low chaos can be a fairly slow-paced affair where you sneak past enemies cautiously and stick to ceiling lights, hide under tables, and generally wait for openings and patrol routes to present themselves. Then, when powers enter the mix, you can start being a bit more creative with your solutions to problems, possessing guards to slip past enemies, using bend time to bend time, and get to a position without alerting the guards. Low chaos is that perfectionist stealth gameplay that is kind of how you would usually play a stealth game. The refusal to kill enemies, set off alerts, or at the very least not play like a total psychopath that kills everyone they see. Because you can still kill people in a low chaos playthrough, there's just a threshold where if you kill too many, you enter high chaos. So the exact line is never clear, and that can pose problems if you're just playing casually and want to see where the game may toe the line in morality. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just say that low chaos playthroughs either involve no killing whatsoever or minimal murder outside of specific instances like self-defense or targets meeting their demise. In comparison, high chaos runs are horrifying. Murdering anyone and everyone in numerous ways is almost a mandate, and if stabbing them gets boring, you've got a gun, crossbow, grenades, spring razors, rats, heights, immolation, friendly fire, disintegration, and I cannot forget a classic, drowning.
They're eating her!
The amount of diverse and distinct ways you can kill in Dishonored is not only hilarious, but it's downright scary. I walk into a situation and think to myself, gee, what tool do I want to use today? Now, I don't know how much that says about me specifically, or Arcane for making this game, but I do know that I absolutely love it. But how is any of this breaking the rules? Well, I think that because high chaos is so directly opposed to a low chaos run, and the fact that it celebrates what you do by giving you a more messed up world, which is the goal of high chaos. If you're doing all this, you don't want things to be sunshine and roses by the end. I think denying the usual stealth morality is a pretty clear breaking of the rules. High chaos playthroughs of Dishonored can fly in the face of conventional stealth design by letting you demolish crowds of enemies with ease. You know what the through line of every other stealth game I've mentioned in this video is? It's that combat is hard. Getting caught and fighting off all the enemies is a challenge in other stealth games. Even the ones I've mentioned in this video make active combat something that is hard to deal with. But in Dishonored, you're essentially playing Devil May Cry, while everybody else is experiencing Mount and Blade. Enemies cannot keep up with you if you decide to make full use of your abilities. Hell, even if you don't make use of some of Dishonored's really good stuff, you can cruise by most combat encounters with well-timed blocks and good positioning. Corvo is a powerhouse and is able to deal with guards so efficiently. Eventually, a combat encounter feels more like playing with your food and arranging the peas on your plate into a skull, which I definitely never did. This sort of playstyle makes missions fly by because you obviously don't need to worry about being caught, and enemies aren't so much like speed bumps as they are little pebbles you kick on the curb sometimes. They're a minor inconvenience at best, and at worst, you may need to use a grenade or two to thin out their ranks. And very similarly to Hotline Hotline Miami, the exit out of some levels is remarkably grim as you walk past the evidence you leave behind. Dishonored lets you be devilishly evil in the Boyle Mansion level by letting you freely kill every single person at the party, and usually figuring out which target is the real one is a process of elimination by gathering clues from other party guests, when in High Chaos you may as well just kill all three of them because one of them will be the target. Capping it all off, you can sign Corvo's name in the party register, letting the remaining targets still just obsess in fear over Corvo's rampage that will eventually lead them to their door. But all of this plays into the power fantasy that Dishonored is. It's a game that gives you this power and questions what you do with it. Corvo is supposed to be this broken entity wreaking havoc on Dunwall, if that's what you decide that he wants to be. And yes, while High Chaos can be seen as a negative ending for the game, I don't think it's a route that is supposed to distinctly punish you for any reason. Sure, characters are more afraid of Corvo in High Chaos, and you get a bleaker ending, but that's the point. You shouldn't get a happy ending after playing this game like a total psychopath, and characters being far more wary of Corvo just sells this pathway through the game so much more. Playing Dishonored like a madman, with no moral code or limit to how far you go, is still pretty damn refreshing. And I think that the game could have doubled down on the vibe so much more. Corvo should have had guards absolutely terrified at the sight of him by the end, turning the final level into a suitably grim affair where the guards just let him walk by, as they know they can't touch him, fear guiding their actions as they see the Reaper walk the cobblestones of Dunwall. Civilians should flee at the sight of Corvo too, as a guy that looks like this walking towards them with a blood-soaked blade, yeah, that's a good sign to run away. High Chaos is a very cathartic experience, especially as far as revenge-fueled tales go. And having the distinct choice to be gentle and fair and act like a ghost, but denying that path and going all out to kill everyone you see is equally cool as it is horrifying in the moment. And selling that idea further by having more characters fear Corvo would have been brilliant. This idea is subtly done with a confrontation against Dowd, where in High Chaos he summons everyone he can to help take you down, while in Low Chaos he demands to fight Corvo himself honorably. In High Chaos, Dowd is either genuinely afraid or adamant in his will to live in that moment. Also, part of what makes High Chaos fun to begin with is how quick and satisfying the swordplay in Dishonored is, which only gets better as Corvo's power increases and he gets to toy around with his enemies, stopping time just to prepare a crossbow bolt for a bunch of enemies only to then unleash them all at the same time. It feels so good to do, and makes Corvo feel extremely overpowered. But again, that's kind of the point. A High Chaos run is a power fantasy at the end of the day, and the idea of making combat play out this way, where enemies are frankly helpless against you, goes against the grain of nearly every stealth game I can think of. Dishonored is also interesting for making the moral pathway through the game change not with scripted dialogue choices, but with direct actions in the gameplay. Getting caught, killing everyone you see, and moving forward isn't penalized in the same way another stealth game would do. The status screen does not tell you that you distinctly did a bad thing, it just says how many people died and the chaos you've caused, neither of which can necessarily be seen as a negative stat, because if your goal is to commit genocide, then this number is actually a good thing. But the kind of consequences a killing has does upset people, and I can see why. Dishonored gives you the ability to be a complete maniac, but I think it's fair if people don't want that sort of baggage affecting their ending, especially if they're not trying to do a High Chaos run, but end up killing enough people to cross that barrier anyway. Which is why Deathloop exists in the form that it does. Deathloop feels like a direct answer to the problem that some people have with Dishonored, where a morality system sort of gets in the way of having fun in the game. So Arcane decided to make a game where there are no consequences for any action that isn't straight up dying. And even then, you can die 3 times and it's fine. This is a game where, just like Dishonored, you are presented with a gigantic amount of ways to kill people in hilarious ways. But the key difference here is that killing has no consequences and is the only way to dispatch these enemies. Even when you kill them, their bodies disappear, since this is a big time loop and nothing you do during it necessarily matters. There's a cool idea here that lets players unleash their weirdly dark, violent fantasies in a setting that harbors no judgment for that behavior whatsoever. It's a complete denial of the stealth genre's main characteristics, like I mentioned earlier on. And while that is worth celebrating, I think Deathloop goes too far in not giving the player any sort of feedback for the way they're playing the game. It ends up feeling really similar to Hotline Miami and Splinter Cell Conviction, where killing doesn't matter, but neither does the stealth. And I think these playstyles work brilliantly in Dishonored because it feeds in so beautifully with the overarching narrative and point of the game. But in Deathloop, I can't help but feel like the experience is far less interesting because the game doesn't reflect your playstyle very much, which feels disappointing to play through after Dishonored for me. But setting aside my own feelings for a minute, it's clear that Deathloop is the prime example of a stealth game that breaks the one rule that matters: consequence. And I think it's hard to balance those two ideals. Consequence or freedom from consequence. Most of these games are the latter, while Dishonored kind of dances in the middle and allows you to get the best of both worlds in a way, by letting you play like a ghost or a murdering maniac with a world that reflects either outcome. I personally love to tackle stealth games in both ways at the end of the day, and I don't think striving for ultimate perfection is the only way to enjoy a stealth game. Ultimately, I think stealth games that freely let you experience and write out the consequences of being caught without directly punishing the player and still being fun can be really satisfying to experience. Games like this are even better when breaking these rules leads to satisfying gameplay moments, so altering the narrative in a way that's noticeable. And it all feeds back into that idea that I mentioned earlier: reward. Rewarding a playstyle with elements that fit that playstyle and encounters that are fun no matter how you tackle them is what makes breaking the rules of stealth fun in the first place. Hotline Miami is a thrill ride of ultra-violence that tells a suitably grim story about the actions that the player finds enjoyment in. Splinter Cell Conviction is a denial of the franchise's core design ideas in favor of something that lets the player let loose. Sam's a free agent that can do what he wants, and even if that idea isn't fully explored to the point I'd like it to be, it's an interesting one to poke around in. And Dishonored is the ultimate example of a stealth game that breaks the rules. You can play it like a normal stealth game and be rewarded for that style of play. Or you can be a complete and utter maniac without the game screaming that you did the wrong thing. Well, it does by giving you a kind of bleaker ending, I guess, but again, if you kill this many people in the game, yes, that's kind of the point. I feel like that's what you're aiming for. In contrast, Deathloop feels like it wants to fully embrace that freedom of expression, but it doesn't reward any style of play distinctly. The options to be stealthy or loud are there, but the game doesn't reward you for either playstyle. And to me, that makes sticking with either really hard to do. And that's not necessarily the point, right? You can be fluid between the two if you want, but none of it necessarily feels that good to me. There's no outward reason to be a stealthy character or strictly a loud one, and there's value in playing both sides for sure, but because you don't get that feedback and because the actions you take distinctly don't matter, it's hard to wholly care. What's funny is that I think Deathloop actually goes too far in breaking the rules. By not having consequences in the gameplay or reflections in the narrative, killing and getting into combat is kind of meaningless, which goes against the grain of a usual stealth game, but not in a way that feels right. Breaking the rules of stealth needs to be rewarded either through a story that comments on those actions or with mechanics that reward that style of play, which is why I think Dishonored mixes with my brain juices so good. I can experience both kinds of a stealth game, and it's never not a good time for me. I guess the ending statement of this video is that Arcane is the master of this sort of gameplay, but it kind of missed the mark with Deathloop. So, yeah, that's a pretty unsatisfying way to end this, I guess.